Has the government acted fast enough on Sudan? Should young drivers be banned from giving lifts to friends? And why there's a shortage of NHS dentists? This is Politics Live. Joining me in the studio, Conservative MP Jonathan Gullis, Labour's Shadow Minister for Local Government and Faith, Sarah Owen, Green Party MP Caroline Lucas and comedian and former Conservative aide, Sarah Southern. Today.
This does remain dangerous, this does remain difficult. We are providing what assistance that we can and we are operating as quickly as we can.
The government announces an evacuation scheme for British citizens trapped in Sudan. But has valuable time been lost? Another setback for Rishi Sunak's small boats plan, as the Equalities Commission says it could breach international law. Should new young drivers be banned from carrying young passengers? We'll hear from a road safety charity who think it could save lives.
11 million people at the moment, we estimate, cannot gain access to an NHS dentist, and that's just shocking.
And as MPs discuss the shortage of NHS dentists, how can more of us get affordable treatment? Let's start with the evacuation of British nationals from Sudan. You heard James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, there in the headlines. It does seem to be starting because the short ceasefire is holding for now. It's thought there are around 4,000 British nationals in Sudan, and it looks as if an RAF plane has already departed an airfield north of the capital Khartoum. It's heading to a British military base in Cyprus. Now, that's according to a plane tracking website being monitored by BBC News. We don't yet know who was on the plane, whether it had British evacuees on board. We presume so, but we're hoping to get more details later on. But the question that was posed to James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, is one I'm going to ask the panel, starting with you, Jonathan, is should that evacuation have started sooner? Has valuable time been lost?
I personally think it was the right thing to do to wait until there was a ceasefire announced. That's clearly as safe as it possibly can be. Obviously, there was meant to be a ceasefire over the Eid period, which sadly wasn't able to be upheld. We're aware, obviously, of the French evacuating their diplomats,
yes,
and actually one being very seriously wounded. Hopefully they will pull through, and I think therefore it's right, as James Cleverly has said himself, that he had confidence that he could evacuate people out of that country and ensure that children aren't being shot at on the way. And so I think it's the right thing to do, that we now put all our energy into this short period of time to get those people onto planes who are British nationals and get them back to this country safely.
You mentioned France. It wasn't just France, actually. France, Germany, Italy and Spain had already started evacuating some of their nationals. Over 1,000, in fact, EU nationals have already been taken out of Sudan. So it does rather imply the UK government could have started far sooner.
I personally think the UK government's shown that it had to prioritise the diplomats inside the embassy, which we're experiencing fighting on both sides of that building. And I want to thank our incredible armed forces who risked their lives to get those diplomats out under a probably situation that none of us can ever consider. So I think that ultimately the government is doing the right thing, but of course at the same time the government can't continue to give live updates. This is very sensitive, security sensitive information will be going through, and of course I appreciate the transparency Andrew Mitchell gave to the House yesterday, and he said he will come back with further details as and when plans have been got seen through.
Sarah Owen, do you agree with what you've heard and what the government has actually done, the decision it's taken, or do you think it should have happened, this evacuation, even before a ceasefire was in place?
I think we've got to make the most out of this ceasefire, the 72-hour ceasefire that we have, make sure that it holds, and government should be working with regional and national officials to ensure that this ceasefire holds and to get as many people to safety as possible, and also to learn the lessons from Afghanistan that we saw, and to make sure that we can get as many of our British nationals back home, and for people with relatives and loved ones in Sudan here in the UK to get information to them is absolutely critical.
I mean, there has been anxiety, as you would expect from people stuck in Khartoum mainly, but in Sudan in general. Problems with registering, it seemed, with the Foreign Office. But now there is a ceasefire. Do you agree that that was the best option for the government rather than starting it sooner?
I mean, it's so hard to sit here and make that decision, isn't it? I mean, I can imagine it must have felt very frustrating to be sat in Sudan and seeing people from other nationalities being taken out much more quickly than you yourself were. I understand, of course, that the UK has far more people there, somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000, we don't know. But what I would say is that what I have heard again and again is that the communications have been woeful. And I think that is something that could have been done better. Certainly last week, for example, where it seems like the telephony was still up and running, we could have been telling people much more clearly that when they were registering, for example, that registration had been received. As I understand it, people weren't getting that confirmed, that you could register on behalf of other people. That wasn't being allowed. There were questions about whether or not GDPR issues were stopping some of that registration happening. So I think there are lessons to be learnt from that. But I would just echo what Sarah has said. Let's just hope that this ceasefire holds and get people out.
Sarah?
Well, obviously, there will be lessons to be learnt from this, absolutely. I think it's been interesting how people have compared it to the Afghanistan withdrawal or evacuation. Obviously, that was very different in that we had quite a lot of resource there over a decade, whereas we haven't quite had that in Sudan. Let's hope that we can get the 4,000 people, British nationals, out of there as safely and as quickly as possible, and absolutely that this ceasefire maintains.
Let's just show you the BBC News, the live page here for people who are following this story and perhaps have relatives or friends in Sudan. You can see there the RAF flight leaves Sudan as UK evacuation operation starts. That will provide live updates on this story. And if there is any more detail about that flight once it does touch down in Cyprus, we will bring it to you. Let's talk about the government's illegal migration bill. It is back in the Commons for its third reading, with the government set to table several amendments to appease, many reporters are saying, backbench rebels. Now, the Home Secretary is expected to gain the power in certain circumstances to ignore interim injunctions, they're called, from the European Court of Human Rights, nothing to do with the European Union, known as Rule 39 orders that ground deportation flights. Also, the government began its legal defence of the Rwanda policy in the Court of Appeal yesterday, which would mean that people arriving, if the bill is passed and if it wins this court battle, that migrants arriving by boat on UK shores will be deported to Rwanda to have their asylum claims processed there in order to remain there. The policy has previously been ruled lawful in the High Court. But let me just show you this story. We mentioned it in the headlines. BBC News illegal migration bill risks breaching human rights obligations, warns the watchdog. Jonathan, you're one of those Tory MPs who would like the government to ignore the court rulings of the European Court of Human Rights when it comes to this. Are you going to ignore this too?
Well, I think what's important to understand here is the amendment that myself and other colleagues like Danny Kruger worked with the government on over the Easter recess is about Rule 39 orders, as you've said, Jo. Rule 39 orders are not part of the original convention that we signed up to. They're not legally binding. The first one issued was in 2005. Now, there are some people who may want to treat them as case law and therefore, in effect, make them become legally binding. But the argument I would argue is that there is no precedent for that to have to be set. And ultimately, these pyjama injunctions put at the last minute to stop the government and frustrate the government from enacting its policy on border control, which is what taking back control is all about, is not appropriate, and we should therefore have the right. And the question for the Labour Party will be, if they're in government in 18 months' time, like they say they will they ever ignore Rule 39 orders to carry on the wishes of this bill, or will they scrap the illegal migration bill if they come to power?
Well, Sarah, and what do you say to that?
Oh, I think the question is that since 2018, we've seen small boat crossings increase. So there was 299 in 2018, and now this year we're looking at 45,000. And we were promised that the National Borders Act was actually going to solve this problem. It hasn't solved this problem. This isn't the fault of lefty lawyers. This isn't the fault of opposition. This is the fault of 13 years of Tory government. If you'd wanted to solve this issue, you would have solved it by now. And you absolutely haven't. And after 13 years, people are asking, do they feel better off and do they feel safer? The answer is no.
The problem here with listening to that, Jo, is that, of course, we originally had the Eurotunnel, we've had lorries be a problem, and obviously smugglers have now moved to small boats where they're seeing success to date. And actually, Keir Starmer's Labour Party, which Sarah is part of, has voted now over 30 times to prevent us from enacting tougher policies when it comes to illegal economic migrants choosing to come from safe mainland France to the United Kingdom, which is totally unacceptable, but also is unnecessary for people risking their lives. And Sarah's got 36 hours to be straight with the British public and say whether or not she is going to back the bill and stop the boats, because Labour, sadly, flip-flop from issue to issue. We've seen that with Jeremy Corbyn being best friends. Then not.
Labour have a clear plan
Don't
rather
talk over
than
each other, but
Labour
go on,
have a
Sarah.
clear plan rather than just a three-word slogan, which is completely empty and meaningless.
What's
And
the plan?
what we've seen is actually completely ineffective. It's
What's the
made the
plan,
situation worse. Firstly, we'd scrap the Rwanda deal and we'd use that money, the millions of pounds of taxpayers' money, and we'd fund a police border force unit.
That's
We'd
already
also
happening.
use that to clear the backlog of immigration and asylum claims. 166,000. That is what it is at the moment. 8 times more than when we left office. And people need to know whether they have a right to stay in this country, and if they don't, then we need to be able to repatriate
And how
them.
would that
so
break-
that's the plan.
and
And
how-
it's more than a 3-word slogan.
How would that break the
There's not a
people smuggling operation? How would it stop the demand for people wanting to get into those boats?
We need to have safe and legal routes, and that
that's a different argument. But and we'll come to that in just a moment, because that's something another group of Conservative MPs would like to see on the statute book. But as we go back to the illegal migration bill risking breaching human rights obligations, you want to ignore those particular judgments by the European Court. Do you also want to ignore warnings from the Equalities Commission on Human Rights too?
What I want to do is to make sure that we actually deliver on that promise, that 5th pledge made by the Prime Minister, which is one of the people's priorities.
And you will ignore
to stop
that
the
too.
boats.
That's all I'm trying to get is clarity on that.
And what we're saying is that we're going to go through the court system, Jo, and we've already won, as you say, in the High Court. I have no doubt that we'll win in the Court of Appeal. And if it needs to go to the Supreme Court, we'll win there as well. And then this policy will be enacted. And what people will see is a very clear difference between a Labour and Conservative Party, which is Labour will have uncontrolled, unfettered mass migration
entirely
into this
untrue.
country, and they have no plan apart from give the French
just
more
given you a
money.
plan.
They have no more plan apart from more borders on more people on the French border.
There is an argument that people would say it's under a Conservative government that the numbers of people crossing in small boats has increased exponentially, it seems, year on year.
That's successful smuggling gangs.
Despite what you've tried to do. On the other hand, there isn't anything in Labour's plan so far that would actually break those people smuggling gangs. Are you against this bill in its entirety?
I am utterly against this bill. I think it's illegal, immoral, it's divisive, it's dangerous. I think it's grotesquely inhumane, it's cruel. Yes, you bet. The Green Party is absolutely against this bill. It's unworkable, as Sarah set out, but I think it's also utterly immoral. I think that to treat some of the most vulnerable people in the world in this way is wrong. And I think as well that unless you're going to put safe and legal routes in place, then you're never going to solve the problem at source. That is what people need. And the idea that somehow the UK needs to uniquely break international law because we are uniquely being affected by this is just wrong. 17 EU countries take more refugees than we do and asylum seekers. We are well down that list.
And would you have
Most
safe
of them
and legal
actually stay...
routes from how many countries would you have those safe and legal routes from?
Well, people have to be able to seek asylum if they are fleeing from persecution.
From anywhere in the world.
If they are rightly seeking safety from dangerous situations, then that is what the international refugee law asks for. So, of course, you then assess them, whether or not they actually do have a right to be in this country. But to try and stop people even being able to make that application, I think is fundamentally wrong.
I mean, there's a difference there. You say the bill is unworkable. Caroline says it's immoral.
And unworkable.
And unworkable. But do you actually think it's immoral? Or do you just think it won't work?
I think the Rwanda plan is immoral, and I think that has had wide condemnation, and I think this is all part of that conversation. It can't be seen in isolation, because this is trying to solve a problem that actually they are part of the issue and the problem, and they cannot see it themselves. They blame absolutely everybody else without looking at their own record.
I mean, the interesting thing is that the Conservative Party itself is split on this issue. There are a group of MPs, it looks as if they have got their way, including Jonathan Gullis, when it comes to those court rulings. But there's another group, a growing group of Conservative MPs who are very concerned about the treatment of child migrants. How difficult is it going to be for Rishi Sunak to hold this coalition together within his own party?
Well, it is very difficult for him because across the Conservative Party, this is an issue that divides people. I feel very uncomfortable, and it really does make me not want to support the party at times because of this issue. We all want to stop the small boats because we want to protect people. We don't want people putting their lives in risk, whether it's for migration or indeed for seeking asylum. We don't want that. We want to stop the gangs. Whatever the best way of doing that, obviously I don't have the answer. I don't think anyone around this table fully has the answer for that yet. But anything that begins to talk about taking children away from their parents, putting them in detention, makes those of us who sit on the kind of compassionate Conservative side of the party feel incredibly uncomfortable and not support any of those aspects of any bill. I certainly wouldn't be supporting anything like that.
Jonathan, do you support your colleagues who want to see legal protections for child migrants?
Well, I'm going to be supporting the bill and with the amendments that have come forward, those put
So
down by other oppositions.
Yes.
So Tim Lawton's amendments, which the government's backing, I will be backing those. I actually think the compassionate thing to do personally, and I personally would argue I'm compassionate in this matter, is to stop these journeys from taking place, because there is no need for people to needlessly put their lives in danger by crossing the channel. There's no need to put thousands of pounds in the hands of smuggling gangs. And I think ultimately what we're trying to do is to do what we had to do before with the Eurotunnel, do what we've done before with the lorries, and stop people trying to illegally enter this country.
Jonathan, if there aren't safe and legal routes, why is there no need for people to have to do what they are doing? They're only risking their lives because there is no alternative. Nobody wants to put this country is indeed a compassionate country, and it deserves better than you.
And over 500,000 people have already come here since 2015 through many different routes, and therefore this country has shown time again, as well as this Conservative government, that when people are in need, whether that be from Syria, Afghanistan, Ukraine, Hong Kong, we will stand up and be
Afghanistan.
All right, hang on. I will let you pick up on Afghanistan. There are safe routes for those particular people that you've talked about, people from Ukraine. There were and still are from Syria. On Afghanistan, you're right, very few people have come across.
Well, and in the first 3 months of this year, almost 1,000 people who were using those boats were from Afghanistan. And the reason for that, Jonathan, is because your safe and legal routes from Afghanistan do not work. They are an absolute joke. It's a terrible joke on people who have worked alongside us, whose lives are at risk every day of the week. And we are not actually providing them with those safe and legal routes we promised under the so-called ACRS Pathway 3. So this is one of the channels that people are supposed to come out by. There's been just a handful just in the last few weeks. And before that, over a year went by and not one single person came out on that pathway.
Does something need to be done about that as part of this bill, to have those safe and legal routes in place before
the bill's
passed?
Government has accepted amendments and has put down amendments. They'll be reporting back to Parliament about where those safe and legal routes are going to be, how it's going to work, a cap in place as well. And I think that's a positive thing. We should, of course, take our fair share, but of course places like Stoke-on-Trent, which have already got 1,279 asylum seekers and illegal migrants in the city, so taking up school places, a strain on public services, taking up hotels in our city, which is damaging our tourism industry. These are cities that for over 30 years now have been a part of the voluntary asylum dispersal scheme, whilst other areas, particularly in leafy parts of London run by Labour, chose to virtue signal in council meetings or in the chamber of the House of Commons, but didn't take their fair share of refugees. Why is it that Stoke-on-Trent has to shoulder the burden for this country when we're taking more than double the population that has Scotland?
Let me come back to Sarah, because you've mentioned, as have other Labour MPs, the plan from Labour, which is dealing with process, really. But beyond process, which the government has taken up, they want to deal with the backlog. They've made a deal with France. Well, they have made a deal with France that is going to help to some extent, they claim. What is Labour promising to do to stop that model and to stop the small boats?
I will repeat that the problem is process. They broke the Home Office. They've broken the asylum process completely.
And that will take time.
Has just handed over a business model to smugglers in small boats.
Ridiculous.
And that is exactly what this is. This is a smuggler's bill.
No,
this
is
is
not.
all this is going to do.
It's not stopping smuggling gangs, Sarah. You know that.
You've had 13 years to do this, and the problem has got so much worse. And in those 13 years, some of it you were left as a minister in Liz Truss's government, and you still didn't solve the problem.
So I was in the Department for Education. I don't know what the Minister for School Standards can do about the Home Office brief.
Why should people trust you after 13 years of this? And to be honest,
because we tackled the Eurotunnel, we tackled trucks and lorries, and now we're going to be tackling small boats as well.
Would you have a cap?
That's a smuggling gangs model that we're trying to break.
But let me put to Sarah, would you have a cap on the number of people who could come annually from and through safe and legal routes from countries like Eritrea, from countries like Iran?
I think that this is a really kind of dead-end part of the conversation, because, as you've seen, we live in a tumultuous society at the moment globally. We're looking at
voters might want to know.
We're looking at Ukraine.
Exactly.
Would you have predicted Ukraine? Would you have predicted Sudan? Would you have predicted Afghanistan? No, none of us would have been able to predict that. And I think that you have to look at this on a case-by-case...
OK, so you'd have an open-ended...
No, it's not open-ended.
Well,
but you have to look,
Sarah?
You have to look at the society and the global situation that we have right now. We're staring at...
What a beautiful argument for the European Union. I mean, I can't help but say it, but honestly, what you would want to do is to find a way for people to be able to take those who are fleeing persecution in a fair way? What kind of multinational way could we think of doing that? Oh, I wonder if the EU might just have been a very good way of actually being able to do that.
I mean, Sarah, your view in terms of perhaps voters wanting to know if there would be open-ended agreements or numbers from other countries when you have got instances like Ukraine, something that was unexpected?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think what we've seen with people from Ukraine coming to live here over the last 12 months is they have really integrated in society. I'm sure everyone here today has been to some cultural event with Ukrainians in their community, and it's been wonderful. But we haven't necessarily seen that across the board. And as Jonathan says, we have got a lot of migrants at the moment living in hotels. That doesn't help the migrants, it doesn't help the local community, and we need to find a better solution to that. We don't want people coming here and working illegally, being paid, you know, under the table, not having rights. That's not on. We've got to have people coming here who can live and have really fulfilled lives and be part of our communities. We want to stop the small boats so that people are safe and are able to come here in the best way possible.
Let's show you this headline on a completely different subject about young drivers. It's in The Times. It's looking at some restrictions that could be put in place. New young drivers to be banned from giving their friends a lift. Ministers target under 25s with something called graduated driving licence. This is something that is being looked at, certainly something that campaigners are calling for. Some of the figures: drivers under the age of 25 are 4 times more likely to be involved in a fatal crash if they are driving with other people in the car, according to road safety charity Break. One of the ideas is that there would be a ban on carrying passengers under the age of 25 in the first year or 6 months after passing the test. Let's talk to Joanna Bailey. She is a trustee from the charity Break and a personal injury solicitor. You back the idea, hello to you, you back the idea of a graduated driving licence. Why do you think they're a good idea?
Because ultimately, sadly, although the number of people who are drivers within the 17 to 24 age bracket, that 7% of people have got the licences, but they account in 2001 for 18% of people killed or seriously injured. And ultimately, we've got to do something to help young drivers basically make the transition from being a non-driver to being a safe driver. Now,
6 months to a year is one of the ideas that has been proposed. That is a ban on carrying young passengers in the car. What other ideas are there being put forward by you? Break.
There are things, obviously reducing the amount of alcohol that anybody should have in their blood level. Ideally, we say there should be none. We could be looking at speed. We could be looking at the engine size of the kind of vehicle that somebody is able to drive. You know, ultimately, it is really about taking time to say this is a new skill, and it's quite right and proper that over the course of that first year, that ultimately you learn other skills along the way that ultimately will help you to make sure that you and your friends are more safe on the road.
What do you say to the government's response thus far, which is actually technology and education is the way to deal with the figures?
Well, ultimately, when you are dealing with a bereaved family, as I do with my day job hat on, that is not going to be your answer. It's part of the answer, and we sincerely hope that the education is going to improve things considerably. But ultimately, we're really asking too much for somebody who's new to driving on the road to spend a year actually putting those skills to good use and making sure that they're a safer driver at the end of that experience than they would have been on day one.
Jonathan, is this something ministers should look at seriously?
Well, look, I think education for me is always a really critical, important way to improve anything. I would say that, of course, I'm a former teacher, so I think education can have a major impact. Of course, I feel for all those families who have lost loved ones, particularly well before they should have done. But I do have some concerns that for those living in rural areas, or those in areas like Stoke-on-Trent, where sadly public transport isn't where we want it to be at this moment in time, people will need to get to university, need to get to college, or need to get to job work in order to obviously pay their bills, to live, to afford, particularly with the cost of living. So I think that this is where a challenge is, as well as actually being able to enforce this policy, I think will also cause problems as well, when we already know that police forces, for example, may well be stretched, particularly in my area where we're dealing with drugs lines, county line gangs in drugs or other serious offences as well. So I think that, the aim is noble. I hope the government will take it seriously and listen and give a detailed response to the ideas. And of course, if there's things that we can do to improve, we should. I'm shamelessly the chair of the APPG for defibrillators, and I would like to see, for example, first aid as part of the driving test in order to make sure every young person can, God forbid, if they ever needed to, perform CPR.
Sarah?
Absolutely. My heart goes out to anybody who's lost a loved one on a road traffic accident, particularly young people. And it was the first thing I ever said in Parliament was about safety of smart motorways after a number of fatalities on the stretch of M1 outside Luton. But I think that on this, we really need to look at the unintended consequences. There will be people who are under 25 who will have family members, who will be parents, who will need to use their car for work, and particularly shift work. Yeah. And so I think we need to look at the proposal very seriously in terms of how this is going to impact young drivers.
So you're not convinced as yet?
I think that more consultation, more work needs to be done, particularly for young drivers who are already penalised quite heavily with very high insurance costs as well, and looking at that in the round of the cost of living crisis at the moment as well.
Caroline?
I'm quite sympathetic to the proposal, I have to say, partly because, as we say, the young person being injured or dying in that situation is just so awful. The evidence that Brake have brought to bear to suggest how much more likely that is if you've got a young person driving with other passengers in the car, I think is something that should give us pause for thought. And I think that in this country we do have an extraordinary complacency almost about traffic accidents. It's almost as if we think they're inevitable and so we're not going to do as much as we possibly can to avoid them. And so I think this is certainly a proposal that is worth more consideration. I mean, I'm absolutely out there saying we want more public transport to give people other alternatives as well, obviously, and want things like lower speed limits on residential roads, 20-mile-an-hour limits on residential roads as well. So there's a suite of things that can be brought in, I think, to help. But I would certainly think this is something worth looking at.
I mean, just as an example, Sarah, Australia saw a 29% reduction in fatalities among the 15, I suppose younger here, 24 age group from 2004 to 2014 with graduated driving licences.
Yes, I know that Australia's had a slightly different system to us for quite a period of time. But as someone who grew up in a very rural community, getting my driving licence at 17 was a real burst of freedom. There was only 2 buses a week from my house, so being able to drive.
Get affordable public transport in rural areas. It's not rocket science, but successive governments have just failed to do it.
Joanna.
Could I just say that, nobody's saying that drivers, albeit young, have to wait until they're 25 when you can take a test when you're 17. What we're asking for is additional skills and time for people to get used to being behind the wheel, where they're going to be therefore less at risk and putting people that they have put as passengers in their car at less risk over a period of 1 year. If you've waited 17 years to get a licence, it really shouldn't be too much to ask ultimately to make sure that you are driving safely and that we as older people are giving an opportunity for youngsters to actually get to grips with a very lethal piece of machinery.
Convinced?
I think that certainly more work has to be done, and I would say that on this isn't just one part. There's not one answer to this. We've seen a massive drop in the number of traffic officers by 15% in the last few years as well. It's about making all of our roads safe for everybody that use them.
For me, it comes back to the point that we have been promoting for a long time now, carpooling, car sharing, particularly for sixth formers going to school, where the kids going to college, kids going to university. So I think that will always be taken into account. But Caroline is right, and I know Sarah about this campaign as well.
You can take that. You can
I don't know if that's the endorsement Caroline wants, but I think, as Caroline's right, public transport is absolutely a way forward. And in Stoke-on-Trent, we saw further cuts than Beeching originally instigated, which is why the 30 million to improve local bus services has been so desperately needed. But we need to go further, and absolutely we'll see that investment in public transport going forward.
Joanna, have you had any positive noises from government or ministers about this idea?
Well, I mean, it's an idea that's been floating around for a long time. I mean, it's 5 years now since Theresa May sent this proposal off to the Department of Transport. And you do have to kind of ask yourself, how long do we need to wait? And the Roads Ministry is currently considering this as part of a new act, potentially. And is due to have a look and talk to some of the people involved and families on the 16th of May. So I wholeheartedly agree, public transport is, of course, a part of a factor. Better roads policing is part of the factor. Sadly, though, for those people who've lost loved ones, those cuts have meant that the roads are not as well policed. the public transport is not as good an option.
Yes.
And ultimately, when people have got to wait 6 to 12 months to get some extra skills under their belt, that is exactly what we're asking.
Joanna Bailey, thank you very much. We've talked about the shortage of NHS dentists before. Last year, a BBC investigation found that 9 in 10 of them in the UK were no longer taking on new adult patients. Now, following that BBC investigation, the Health Committee set up an inquiry to look into the issues raised, and today senior health officials and a minister will face questions from that committee. Well, not much has changed since that investigation a year ago. Our health correspondent Dominic Hughes went to visit one charity this week which helped people who are struggling to get an NHS dentist. Let's take a look.
The charity Dentaid has come here to Bury St Edmunds because this is a town identified as being in a dental desert where people really struggle to access NHS dentistry. Now, the charity itself was set up some years ago to provide dental care in developing countries. And yet here we are in England in 2023 in a seemingly prosperous town, and loads of people are just desperate for help.
Seeing increasing levels of demand. I think this is the 4th or 5th time we've been to this area, and we do 2 days back to back, and every day we're seeing between 30 and 40 patients a day. People getting here at 7 in the morning, queuing. Last time we were here it was raining and people were just in the queue waiting in the rain. Every single person we see is in pain, has had infections, broken teeth, problems that are affecting eating, speaking, functioning. So it's really, really affecting this area because of problems of accessing dentists here.
Number 9,
I've got a problem with wisdom teeth. I've had 4 children and this is worse.
And for those who are here seeking help, relief from the pain can't come soon enough.
It's probably been worse than anything I've ever experienced, so I'm very glad that this is here today. This week's been long enough because it's taken over my life.
Well, that was a pretty stark film in terms of the pain. That charity that's been set up to provide dental care in developing countries now operating here. Does it shock you, Sarah?
No, not at all. I think going to the dentist is a really confusing experience for a lot of people, whether you either can't get a dentist, you can't work out whether you're getting an NHS dentist or a private dentist, you finally get a dentist, and then when they talk through what treatment you need, they're telling you all these different prices and how it's cheaper if you do it this way or you need to do that. I find going to the dentist an incredibly stressful experience.
But you have got one.
I do have one, but I'm naughty. I rarely go because I find it so terrifying.
Ah, well, terrifying and perhaps the worry of the price. How have we ended up in this situation where so many people, Jonathan, cannot get an NHS dentist? There are dentists, obviously, they're private operators in that sense, but you cannot find an NHS dentist. This is getting to a crisis point.
This is a very serious problem, I don't deny that, and Caroline and Sarah will have their inboxes full of constituents like I do in my own constituency of Stoke-on-Trent, North Kisgrave and Talk, demanding and pleading in some cases for help urgently. Look, the government is trying to react as quickly as it can. There is no doubt that, of course, COVID had a major impact on the dental industry, particularly with the fact that, obviously, because of the close contact that they have through the mouth, that they were not seeing patients as they normally were. That's then had an impact on people working in that profession. But ultimately, there is now a 6.5% increase in dentists available as there was compared to 2010-11.
Dentists operating in the NHS. There aren't, I don't think, literally more dentists in that sense, and obviously from a low bar.
Well, there's more dentists operating, as I said, with the 6.5% increase. There's obviously the extra 50 million that's gone to create 350,000 additional appointments. There's obviously the £3 billion per year funding that already goes into the dentistry.
Let's just look at what you've done to the finances. Under your government, over the last 10 years, we've seen the amount of money in real terms going into this sector drop by a quarter. So, of course, COVID has had an impact. Of course it has. But the way that you've treated this contract with dentists is a major part of the problem.
How much more should go in? Because Jonathan mentions £3 billion, and actually some of that has meant that the costs, even under NHS dentists, are going up. So it's going up by about 8.5%, which might put people off going at all, even if they have an NHS dentist. How much money would you commit?
Well, I wouldn't start with that question. I would start with the question about how do we make sure that everybody in this country can access an NHS dentist.
And
in
how
Brighton,
do you do it?
I'll tell you how you do it in just a second. I just want to say in Brighton, my inbox is absolutely full. You go to the website to try to find a dentist that doesn't have a waiting list, and you simply can't. In terms of what you would do, I think it's time to put back on the table the idea of whether or not it would be more cost-effective to actually have a system with dentistry as we do with the NHS. And I'll tell you why. the biggest cause of admission to hospital of children aged 6 to 10 is because they've got bad teeth and bad oral hygiene and are now really ill.
So you'd want to do what Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, suggested with dentists. He suggested with GPs to take them out of private sort of practice and private entities and bring them into the NHS completely.
I would want to have a look at that in terms of the costs of doing that, because I think it's absolutely unsustainable and economically madness to have a situation where people are not able to get preventive dental care when they need it. So by the time they do go and seek that help, it's going to cost an awful lot more, plus all of their misery to get it sorted out.
Let Jonathan respond and I'll come to you, Sarah. Jonathan?
Well, look, I totally agree that we need to have, obviously, a clear discussion. The government is going to bring forward a specific plan on dentistry and what we can do further down the line. Of course, I'm not, as Sarah's pointed out, I'm no longer in government, so I'm not across those details, but obviously we'll be scrutinising them along with Caroline and Sarah about what they mean for local constituents. And I'm very lucky in Stoke to have Stoke City Football Club, who's just won an EFL Community Award for the work they're doing around dental oral hygiene in young people.
But this is patchwork, isn't it? This is patchwork. If you're looking at something across the country, I mean, does something more radical need to be done?
Well, look, the contracts have been obviously adjusted. So that minimum payment, for example, has now been brought up. So it means in areas where, you know, they were getting with higher deprivation, they're now going to get more money coming in for a start. Flexibility's been put into those contracts as well as obviously actually trying to recruit more overseas dentists or people who are living in this country who have overseas qualifications, making it easier to get those qualifications acknowledged so they can get into the workforce as soon as possible.
Is the problem the contract? Would you change the contract? Would a Labour government look at those contracts with dentists to put a lot more money in them to make sure they do take on NHS patients?
I think you've got to have a whole conversation with dentists. They've been ignored for far too long. And to pretend that this wasn't an issue before COVID, when there were 1,200 dentists leaving the NHS and not being replaced, I think is really disingenuous. People couldn't get a dentist appointment before COVID. And during COVID, that whole process of people leaving NHS dentistry was sped up because they were completely ignored.
Would you change
by
the contract? The contract was done in 2006. There has been some conversation. We've heard from the British Dental Association complaining about that contract. It's difficult to know exactly how much you do get if you take on NHS work. Do you know?
I think that you've got to really listen to the dentists, and I think that we've got to have that wider conversation about what we need and what they need to be able to do their jobs. So throughout the pandemic, I spoke to my dentist practices, and because I knew that they weren't getting any conversation out of the government, and now we're going to have to play catch up. And Labour, under a Labour government, we managed to get dentistry waiting times down from 18 months to 18 weeks, and I'd love for us to be able to have that opportunity to do that again.
And that was because more money was put in?
It's not just more money, but it's also, I think, the way that the NHS dentistry works.
Right. It does seem to be more serious than just having a conversation at this particular point. The contracts seem to be a major issue. Would you put the money in, the billions that are probably needed to put in to actually open it up to more people?
Well, we need to take some dramatic action. I mean, the figures that have come out of this investigation of people not being able to get dentists, we're going to have to do something. If we still want to keep dentistry within the NHS and not make it like optometry, where it kind of is in but not in the NHS, then they're going to have to invest a huge amount of money, because I wasn't aware of that statistic that Caroline just shared of young children being admitted. That's terrifying. We can't have it that young children are mainly admitted to hospital because their teeth are rotting.
This headline in the Daily Mail, while we're talking about the health service, the government will take legal action against the Royal College of Nursing over planned strike. Now, this is the next round of strikes on May the 1st and May the 2nd. The government, the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, is wanting to go to the court because he feels they haven't got a mandate. They're outside their 6-month mandate on May the 2nd. Is that the sort of approach you would take to solve this problem?
Well, I'm disappointed that the negotiation that was agreed and that a lot of the unions had backed and to their membership sadly didn't get through with the Royal College of Nursing specifically in that case when it came to the vote, albeit a very narrow margin of victory in that ballot. So I do hope that very quickly we can get back round the table and avoid having to go through the courts. No one wants to see that as the option.
Steve Barclay does want to see it. He absolutely wants to criminalise nurses. That's what he's doing.
That's not true.
Shameful.
Steve Barclay did not wake up and want to take legal action. He's obviously been advised that if we are going to make sure that we tackle the backlog, the fourth pledge of the Prime Minister and one of the people's priorities, that we need to make sure that nurses and doctors are in their local GPs or in their local hospitals, able to see patients. No more cancellation of
criminalising them is going to
no
make
more
that
cancellation
easier.
of operations. And I hope, therefore, that common sense can prevail and both sides can get round the table and find a way through this. Because we have to get people
You're
back in
backing the
NHS.
strikes, Caroline?
I am backing the strikes because I think that most of those NHS staff are on the picket lines partly in order to make sure that they themselves get a decent pay, but also to make sure that the NHS itself is there, that we don't lose so many nurses and doctors, so that actually people aren't getting the treatment that they deserve. The NHS is already in crisis. And frankly, unless we solve this by putting more money in and getting more nurses recruited, then the effect on people waiting for operations and so forth is going to be even worse. So I hate the idea that people are going to have to wait longer, but frankly, unless we fix this by putting the money in, then they're going to be waiting much, much longer anyway.
Sarah?
I don't like the idea of them going to court on this. I would like the strikes to come to an end, as I think everybody would, but they've got to get back round the negotiation table. We've got to find a resolution to this, because anyone who is going to hospital at the minute is feeling so anxious, so concerned. You know, things are being delayed, appointments are being moved. We've got to find a really good resolution to this swiftly.
The government said it was a fair offer, and it was only narrowly defeated in that ballot by the RCN, the Royal College of Nursing. Do you think the nurses should call off that second day of strikes?
And what I want to see is Steve Barclay do his job. And
but that's not the question. But that's not the question I asked you. Do you want them to call off that second day of strike and accept the pay offer that was made by the government?
They took that decision democratically, and they went to their membership, and more people voted for that decision than actually voted for Rishi Sunak to be Prime Minister. So I think that Steve Barclay actually has to now just respect that decision and find a way through. And that is what a grown-up politician would do.
And how far do you think Steve Barclay should go in terms of a higher offer of pay? Should it be 7%, 2% over what he's offering?
I think that Steve Barclay should listen to the nurses, find out exactly what it is.
Because this isn't
they want
more than 5%. That's clear. So would Labour agree?
This isn't also just about pay. This isn't also just about pay.
I still don't hear
what
Labour...
this message sends to nurses is that this government wants to take you to court to force you to go to work.
So what would the Labour government do?
And I think that what we need to see...
How much would you go? Would you go above 5% to 7%, as Jo's asked?
I think this is a problem that this government has made. And if you're going to ask me to solve it, put me in government.
Well, in 18 months' time, we'll find out, won't we, Sarah? But ultimately, 18 months' time, we'll see, won't we? Well, I've said we'll see. Believe me, I look forward to winning my seat and retaining it, and I believe we'll have a Conservative government.
But you're not that bothered about the rest of the
government. What I do firmly believe is that Labour's continue to be disingenuous with voters. They cart from the sidelines and don't ever offer a credible, detailed alternative, just sound bites and headline grabbing, as we've seen in many different things.
Remember, you're not a minister in government, so you couldn't give yourself details.
Jeremy Corbyn was Labour's best friend, now he's no longer Labour's best friend. Labour was pro a second referendum, and now they're anti a referendum. Labour had 10 pledges to be leader of the Labour Party, now he's ditched them.
We're in local election campaigning mode,
I find
it
unbelievable that Labour flip-flop from one position to the next.
Can I just suggest that what we could do is put a tax on the very richest, a wealth tax, and then we could use that money to pay people at least what they deserve in terms of keeping up with inflation. Otherwise, what we're all talking about is public sector workers actually working really hard for less and less money. We're hearing about nurses who are having to depend on food banks. We're hearing about fire stations where, again, food banks are being set up by the chief fire officer. This is not what we should be doing in the 5th or 6th richest country in the world. There are political choices here. We could go ahead and have a wealth tax on the super wealthy billionaires, do that and pay people what they deserve.
Or on non-doms.
Well, I mean, that's Labour's policy. Is it worth now, in order to resolve particularly the dispute with nurses, going higher than 5%?
That's something that the Secretary of State's got to make a decision on, because
ultimately
he's got to sit down. Well, he's got to sit down with the Chancellor and look at the country's finances and figure out a way forward, because this rise will obviously have a long-term impact, not just on salary, but on pension contributions as well as national insurance contributions. NHS trusts have got to make sure that that is going to be funded as well, or if they are going to have to find some funding, where's that funding coming from? So it's a detailed conversation. As I say, I hope that we can go back with the original offer that the unions themselves were endorsing, go back to their members, get their members to sign up to it, with maybe further commitments to look at working conditions. Because I know for teachers, for example, if you ask teachers what's the number one issue, it's working conditions. It's not pay, that's the second. So if, again, it's like those strikes, I hope they get called off and actually have a sensible conversation about what we can do to make the lives of teachers better in terms of reducing their workload, which is something that I've seen in many schools.
Because we haven't got long.
And that's all well and good. But when you've got ministers that completely ignore the situation until they leave it to strike action, and they're not being listened to at any other time, it is this government's fault that we are seeing these strikes, because they are utterly unable to negotiate any decent deal.
So you are backing the strikes. You'd be happy to go onto the picket line?
I think that what we've got to see is that they need to get back into work, but they need a government that actually listens to them and respects them.
We're going to talk more on this, I think, tomorrow, and also some breaking news that RAF plane from Khartoum has landed in Cyprus. It's still currently unclear if British nationals are on board the plane. That's all we have time for. I'll be back tomorrow at 11:15. Bye-bye.